So some possible implications here are this concept of microaffirmations, right? What do you do if everything is kind of negative? Can you just solve it? Can you remove it? Well, one of the things, and we have a nice table that identifies microaggressions and then possible microaffirmations, ways of reformulating our coaching language and coaching practices. And this is a strengths-based approach that affirms and in cooperation with others negotiates and validates those cultural identities. So it's not meant to be a quick fix, but it is meant to be one alternative rather than, well, what do I do? Do I just repeat the same things, okay? Or do I say nothing? No, okay, we don't. So we can use microaffirmations, which are basically, again, if I think of microaggressions as put-downs, microaffirmations are, praise or building somebody back up. It's catching them doing the right things. So again, sometimes small things, but where we can affirm those cultural identities and say, you know what, you belong here. It's okay. You're part of our story. You're part of our community. Okay. So for example, when I was coaching football down in high school in Mississippi, one of our football coaches, a friend of his died, and our head coach was a white male. His friend was a African American that they had played together back in the 60s, and his friend was the first African American football player, I believe, at college in Mississippi. It might have been a junior college. And the head coach brought the team over, and it was about a 50-50 mixed race team, at least with white and black kids. And he basically gave a very moving, very powerful eulogy for his friend who had just passed away. And he referred back to the racial conflict at that time, noting how much better today's time is, but also how we were able as a team to come together to form a common good, but also then point out the social changes and the good that we have left to do. So again, and the coach didn't talk about microaffirmations and microaggressions in that way, but again, it was here's some empirical evidence now to show how we can do this, okay? And then I added down here this caveat. One of the things that I'm thinking about too is that power is still embedded in the coach-athlete relationship. Power is embedded in everything, and how we influence people and change people's thoughts, feelings, behaviors. We want to be careful that sometimes these microaffirmations or strength-based approaches, also caring, can be used to control people as well. So that's one of the omissions. I wish I would have added that as a caveat in the paper, but again, my thought process on that hadn't kind of gone that far at that time. So again, let's finish up with some implications. Right after you do your study, you've got some implications or future research. What do we want to do? Well, we want to use this story, and this is a nice one. This is why I like doing creative analytic practice and storytelling, is that we want to use this paper and we want to use things like it to help coaches reflect on how cultural identities impact their coaching and others involved and athletes and affect their outcomes. One of the easy ways is to think about the espoused values of sport, right? That sport builds character. It's a myth if we don't try to build character. If we don't try to build communities, if we don't try to change social structures, then sport is reproducing for the powerful or for a small group. Okay, so we can use material like this for coach education reflection. We can help coaches think about their communication strategies, how they tell and prescribe and dictate like authoritarian rulers, or do they engage people in dialogue? Do they talk to athletes in a more equitable way? Again, I'm not saying we let athletes at all times, in all ages, in all contexts, do whatever they please, but can we balance out some of the power structures a little bit, okay? And you have to really read the stories to see how microaggressions then are used to control athletes and to influence their behaviors, to understand this a little bit deeper. We can think about communication here and microaffirmations and aggressions in athlete and team building, right? Not just team building and we're all working together, but how we can really bring together then a diverse group of teams. What would you do if you had a single or multiple racial, ethnic, religious minorities on your team? How can we build a more inclusive environment? How can we be aware of the communication that goes on the locker room, in the locker room or on the field? Okay, and we see this weekly in different sporting events where there's an insensitive, right, a very microaggression shirt or clothing or fans saying something or teams competing against each other saying something. Okay, so we want to treat that communication very seriously as it impacts our behavior and our perception of the world and the negative effects that could occur from it. We want to look at research on positive coaching, right? One of the omissions I would argue there too is mostly culture, right? How does sport build youth? How is sport a positive environment? How do coaches coach positively? Okay, and so we want to look at how that embeds with sociocultural identities, something that hasn't done too much. In the Sociology of Sport Coaching book that I just talked about, the authors talk about the use of humor in that book as a way of reducing tension and getting away from the authoritarian coach. That's great, but humor can also be a microaggression. That's one of the most common ways that we see it, right? People joke, don't worry about it, you're being too sensitive. It's just your problem. Okay, so we want to critique that use of humor as well. And like Bill Walsh, the old 49ers football coach, had in his book, that he did not allow racialized humor in the locker room. And he was also consulted by a sociologist of sport, Dr. Harry Edwards, okay, who was one of the pioneers in the 70s of exactly this kind of work. Okay, we're just bringing it to light again in sport coaching. I want to think about toughness and masculinity as well and how that influences microaggressions. Do we see it as often in men's sports and women's sports? Are we offering microaggressions that embed different cultural identities as a form of making athletes tougher or reproducing these hegemonic masculine norms? And then, again, the last thing we could critique, again, this notion of intersectionality and looking at whiteness, white privilege, all the different forms that intersect with coaches and whose cultural values are being reproduced, why, and thinking about how that's been developed over time. Okay, that concludes this brief introduction to our recent paper in the Sociology of Sport Journal. Look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you for watching.